The cold steel of the handcuffs biting into my wrists was the first thing that broke the spell of my quiet, hard-working life. But it was the look of pure, calculated satisfaction in my brother-in-law's eyes that truly froze my blood. I was being dragged out of the Heritage, the diner I had bled for over 15 years, while my wife stood by the mahogany host stand, her hands trembling not with fear, but with a strange, frantic energy as she began clutching my ledger to her chest before the police cruiser had even pulled out of the parking lot. In that singular, devastating moment, as Officer Mark Vance shoved my head down into the roof of the patrol car, he leaned into my ear and whispered that men like me didn't belong in his town, and that by the time I saw the sun again, every brick of my legacy would belong to someone who actually deserved it. To understand how I ended up staring at the cracked vinyl ceiling of a police interceptor while my life's work vanished in the rearview mirror, you have to understand what the Heritage meant to me. It wasn't just a restaurant. It was a living, breathing piece of history. My grandfather had opened it in 1954, back when the town was nothing but a dusty crossroads and a dream. He had passed it to my father, and my father had passed it to me, along with the secret recipe for the smoked brisket and the heavy, tarnished brass keys that felt like a scepter in my pocket. Every morning for a decade, my routine was a symphony of comfort. I would arrive at 4:30 a.m., the air still crisp and smelling of damp pavement. I'd unlock the heavy oak doors, the wood smoothed by the palms of 3 generations, and the first thing I'd do was breathe in. It was a rich, intoxicating blend of roasted coffee beans, seasoned cast iron, and the faint, sweet scent of maple syrup that seemed to have seeped into the very floorboards. I loved the way the low-hanging amber lamps cast a warm, golden glow over the green vinyl booths, making the whole place feel like a sanctuary against the cold, indifferent world outside. My wife Sarah had been part of that sanctuary for 12 years, or so I thought. We met when she was a college student working summers as a waitress. She was vibrant, quick with a laugh, and she seemed to love the diner as much as I did. When we married, she took over the bookkeeping, and I felt like the luckiest man alive. We had a rhythm. I ran the kitchen, the heart of the house, and she ran the numbers, the brain. We lived in a beautiful colonial house 3 blocks away, a home filled with the soft sounds of jazz on the record player and the smell of the expensive candles Sarah loved. Our life was a tapestry of cozy rituals. Sunday drives through the valley, Friday nights sharing a bottle of wine on the porch, and the shared pride of seeing the Heritage featured in every local travel guide. But there was always a shadow at the edge of our sunny life, her brother, Mark. Mark Vance had been a police officer in our town for 15 years, and from the day I asked for Sarah's hand, he had looked at me with a disdain that he barely bothered to hide. To Mark, I was an outsider, despite my family having lived here for 70 years. He was the kind of man who wore his uniform like a suit of armor, and his badge like a license to intimidate. He'd come into the diner at least 3 times a week, sliding into the corner booth, the one with the best view of the street, and he never once reached for his wallet. He would sit there, nursing a coffee he hadn't paid for, watching me with those pale, cold eyes. He'd make comments, subtle at first, about legacy and pure bloodlines, and how it was a shame that such a prime piece of real estate was held by someone who didn't fit the local aesthetic. I'd always laughed it off, thinking it was just the typical posturing of a man who needed to feel powerful. Sarah would always pat my hand and tell me to ignore him, saying Mark was just old-fashioned and protective. In the months leading up to that morning, things had started to feel thin. The atmosphere in our home, once as warm as the diner's kitchen, had grown brittle. Sarah began spending more time at her mother's house, claiming the old woman needed help with her chores. When she was home, she was often hunched over her laptop, the blue light reflecting in her eyes as she hammered away at the keys. When I'd walk into the room, she'd snap the lid shut, her voice jumping an octave as she told me she was just organizing the tax filings. I noticed too that Mark had stopped coming in for his free coffee. Instead, I'd see his patrol car idling in the shadows across the street late at night after we closed.
I'd see him talking to Sarah in the driveway of our home, their heads close together, voices hushed. When I'd ask what they were discussing, Sarah would just sigh and say they were worried about their mother's medical bills. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her.
I was so blinded by the steam of the grill and the comfort of our 12-year marriage that I missed the way the foundation was being chipped away from under me. I didn't see the way she looked at the deed to the diner, which I kept in a small safe in our home office. I didn't see the way her brother looked at the corner lot the diner sat on, the most valuable commercial property in the county, now that the new highway exit was being built just 2 blocks away. The morning of the arrest started like any other. The sun was a pale sliver on the horizon, and the diner was beginning to fill with the usual breakfast crowd. The construction workers in their neon vests, the elderly couples who shared a single order of toast, the students grabbing coffee before class. I was in the zone, flipping eggs and pressing hash browns, the familiar heat of the stove a comfort against my skin. I remember thinking how lucky I was. I had a thriving business, a beautiful wife, and a name that meant something in this town. Then, the bell above the door chimed. It wasn't the usual cheerful jingle. It sounded like a death knell. I looked up, expecting a hungry customer, but instead, I saw the polished black boots and the dark blue uniform of the local police. Mark didn't come alone. He had 2 junior officers with him, their faces grim and set. The entire diner went silent. The only sound was the sizzle of bacon that I'd forgotten to turn over. "Elias Thorne," Mark said, his voice booming, vibrating with a terrifying, righteous energy. He didn't walk. He marched toward the counter, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. "Mark, what's going on?" I asked, wiping my hands on my apron, a confused smile tugging at my lips. "Did something happen at the house? Is Sarah okay?" He didn't answer. He didn't even look me in the eye. He reached over the counter, grabbed my shoulder with a grip that felt like a vice, and jerked me forward. "You're under arrest for the possession and distribution of controlled substances, and for the systematic laundering of illegal funds through this establishment." The words felt like nonsense. They felt like a foreign language. I felt a cold, prickling sensation wash over my skin, the blood draining from my face so fast I felt dizzy. "What are you talking about? Mark, stop this. This isn't funny." "Turn around," he barked, his voice cracking like a whip. "Now!" As he spun me around and the first cuff clicked, I looked toward the back of the diner. Sarah was standing there. She had come in through the kitchen entrance. She wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming for them to stop. She was standing perfectly still, holding a manila envelope, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Sarah!" I choked out, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Sarah, tell them! Tell them this is a mistake!" She finally looked up. Her eyes weren't filled with the love I'd known for 12 years. They were cold, empty, and underscored by a terrifying streak of ambition. She didn't say a word. She just nodded once to her brother, and then she turned toward the cash register, reaching for the key I kept hidden under the counter. That was when the world tilted. That was when I realized the tax filings weren't taxes, and the medical bills weren't for her mother. I was being erased from my own life, and the people I trusted most were the ones holding the giant, jagged eraser. Mark hauled me toward the door, my feet dragging on the floorboards my grandfather had laid with his own hands, and as we passed the front window, I saw the sign he had already prepared in the back of his cruiser, ready to be taped to my door. Under new management. The holding cell smelled of floor wax and old sweat, a clinical, suffocating scent that seemed designed to strip a man of his dignity. As I sat on the cold metal bench, the fluorescent lights humming like a swarm of angry bees above my head, my mind began to feverishly stitch together the rags of the last 3 months. I had been so blind. I had mistaken the shadows lengthening across my life for a passing cloud, never realizing it was a total eclipse,
orchestrated by the woman I shared a bed with. The warning signs hadn't been screams, they were whispers, so soft I could almost convince myself I hadn't heard them at all. It started with the ledger. Sarah had always been meticulous, her handwriting a neat, flowing script that looked more like art than accounting. But 3 months ago, the neatness turned into a frantic scrawl. I'd catch her at the kitchen table late at night, the glow of her laptop making her face look like a pale, ghostly mask. "Just some discrepancies in the vegetable supplier's invoices, honey," she'd say when I pressed a hand to her shoulder. "Go back to sleep. I've got this." Then there was the night Mark came over for dinner, a rare occurrence that I should have questioned. He didn't eat much.
He spent the entire evening staring at the framed photo of my grandfather standing in front of the diner's grand opening in '54. "You know, Elias," Mark had said, swirling his whiskey with a slow, predatory grace, "a lot of people in this town feel like the heritage is a landmark that belongs to the community, not just one family, especially a family that, well, let's just say a family that hasn't always shared our traditional Locan values." "My family built this town, Mark," I replied, my voice level. "We've fed every mayor, every sheriff, and every working man in this county for 70 years. Mark just smiled, a thin, oily expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Times change. Ownership is a fluid thing. Sometimes the land needs to be returned to those who truly understand its worth." I had looked to Sarah for support, expecting her to shut down his thinly veiled threats. Instead, she was looking at her plate, her fork tracing patterns in the mashed potatoes. "He's just talking about the new zoning laws, Elias," she whispered. "Don't be so sensitive." The real turning point, the moment the earth truly began to crumble, happened just 48 hours before the handcuffs clicked. I had returned to the diner at midnight because I'd forgotten my medication in the office. The building was dark, the neon heritage sign humming its low, buzzing song in the window. As I reached for my keys, I saw a light flickering in the basement window, the old storage room where we kept the dry goods and the backup files. I let myself in quietly, thinking a pilot light had gone out or a circuit had tripped. As I descended the creaking wooden stairs, the air grew cool and damp. I heard voices. "Is it done?" That was Mark's voice, low and gravelly. "The signatures are perfect," Sarah replied. Her voice sounded different, sharper, devoid of the warmth she used for me. "I've been practicing for weeks. The power of attorney and the deed transfer are ready. All we need is the catalyst." "The delivery arrives tomorrow night," Mark said. "I'll handle the search warrant. You just make sure he's in the kitchen when we walk in. I want the customers to see him in the apron. I want the disgrace to be public. It makes the community takeover look like a rescue mission." I stood frozen on the third step from the bottom, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would crack a bone. My lungs felt like they were filling with sand. Every breath was a struggle. My vision blurred at the edges, the world narrowing down to the sliver of light coming through the door. I wanted to scream, to barge in and demand an explanation, but my legs felt like lead weights. I retreated. I crept back up the stairs, my hand trembling so violently I could barely turn the doorknob. I drove home in a trance, the headlights of other cars looking like smeared streaks of white fire. I sat in my car in the driveway for an hour, watching the upstairs bedroom window where I thought my wife was sleeping. The next morning, I tried to find the documents. I waited until Sarah went to her mother's, and I tore through her home office. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps. I felt physically sick, a hot, acidic ball of bile rising in my throat. I found it in a hidden compartment of her vanity, a sleek black leather folder. Inside was the nightmare made manifest. There were my signatures, forged with terrifying precision on documents that signed over the entirety of the heritage and our family home to a holding company called Vance and Associates. But it was the second set of papers that truly broke me. It was a faked confession, typed on my own computer, detailing a massive drug distribution ring I was supposedly running out of the diner's pantry. The room began to spin. I felt a sudden sharp pain in my chest, and I had to lean against the wall to keep from collapsing. My pulse was a deafening roar in my ears, a rhythmic thumping that drowned out the sound of my own sobbing. I looked at the wedding photo on the desk, Sarah and I, smiling under the old oak tree, and I felt a wave of nausea so powerful I had to run to the bathroom. I was staring at the blueprint of my own execution. I should have called a lawyer right then. I should have fled, but I was paralyzed by the sheer, cold-blooded scale of the betrayal. I kept thinking, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is some kind of sick joke. I put the folder back exactly where I found it and went to work the next morning like a ghost walking through his own life. I was flipping those eggs, watching the clock, waiting for the axe to fall. And when Mark walked in, wearing his law and order mask, part of me felt a sick sense of relief. The WhatsApp was over. The execution had begun. Now, sitting in this cell, the physical shock has finally begun to ebb, replaced by something much more dangerous. A cold, crystalline clarity is settling over me. I look at my hands, the hands that have worked the grill for 15 years, the hands that have provided for a woman who just traded my soul for a corner lot. They are still shaking, but the heat of the anger is starting to boil the blood in my veins. "Officer," I yelled, my voice raspy and strange to my own ears. "I want my phone call. Now." The jailer, a young kid who used to come in for blueberry pancakes after his night shifts, looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear. "Mark said no calls for 24 hours, Elias. National security or something." "Mark is a liar," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "And you're about to be an accomplice to the biggest civil rights lawsuit this county has ever seen. Get me the phone, or get me your sergeant." The kid hesitated, his eyes darting to the security camera. For the first time since they put the cuffs on me, I felt a flicker of the man I used to be. The victim was dying. Something else was taking his place. The heavy steel door of the interrogation room groaned on its hinges, a sound like a dying animal. I didn't look up immediately. I kept my eyes fixed on the laminate table, tracing a deep scratch in the surface. When the footsteps stopped, they weren't the heavy, rhythmic thud of Mark's boots. They were the light, clicking strikes of heels, the expensive Italian leather shoes I had bought Sarah for our last anniversary. She sat down across from me. She looked immaculate. Her hair was pulled back into a tight professional bun, and she wore a charcoal gray suit I'd never seen before. She looked like a stranger, a corporate liquidator sent to close out a failing branch. "You look tired, Elias," she said. Her voice was devoid of the melodic warmth that used to greet me every morning. It was flat, clinical. "Tired?" I let out a dry, hacking laugh that turned into a cough. "I'm in orange jumpsuit, Sarah. My brother-in-law threw me into a cage like a dog, and you were holding the leash." She didn't flinch. She opened a slim leather briefcase, not the one I'd seen at home, and pulled out a stack of papers. "Let's skip the histrionics. I'm here because Mark is currently discovering 3 kilos of high-grade narcotics in the false ceiling of the diner's walk-in freezer. By tomorrow morning, the local news will have your face on the front page as the kingpin of Main Street." I felt the blood roar in my ears, a deafening tide. I gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. You planted it. You and your racist, power-tripping brother. You're destroying a 70-year legacy for a corner lot and some highway money. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. It was never just a corner lot, Elias. Do you know how many years I spent smelling like old frying oil? How many years I listened to you drone on about your grandfather's vision while I did the math and realized we were barely staying afloat? You were content being a local legend. I wanted to be a person of consequence. So you stole it, I whispered, the betrayal tasting like copper in my mouth. Every document I found in your vanity, the forgeries. You've been planning this for years. 18 months, actually, she corrected him, her voice chillingly precise. Since the day the Department of Transportation announced the new exit ramp, Mark and I realized that the heritage is worth 5 times its current value as a developed commercial hub. But you would never sell. You'd rather die in that grease pit than let a developer touch your precious history. She slid a document across the table. This is a full confession. If you sign it, Mark will ensure the charges are reduced to simple possession. You'll serve 5 years, and the diner will be seized by the state and sold at auction to a company Mark and I control. If you don't sign, he'll make sure the distribution charges stick. You'll get 25 to life. Think about it, Elias. You aren't a young man. You won't survive a maximum security prison. You're a monster, I said, the words feeling heavy and jagged. I loved you. I gave you everything. For a fleeting second, her mask slipped. A flicker of something, regret, guilt, crossed her face, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, hard ambition. You gave me a life in a small town with a man who peaked in high school. Mark was right about you. You're an anchor, and a comin'. The door opened again, and Mark stepped in. He didn't say a word to me. He leaned against the wall, his hand resting on his belt, watching me with a smug, sickening grin. Time's up, Sarah, Mark said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. The press is already gathering at the diner. We need to go secure the scene. Wait, I said, my voice shaking as I looked at the man I had shared Thanksgiving meals with for a decade. Mark, you're an officer of the law. You're really going to do this? To family? Mark let out a sharp, You were never family, Elias. You were just the guy Sarah brought home to spite our father. You're a placeholder. And as for the law, in this town, I am the law. My father was the sheriff, and his father before him. We decide who stays and who goes. And your time is up. He walked over and leaned down, his face inches from mine. I could smell the peppermint on his breath and the metallic scent of his badge. I've already spoken to the judge. He's an old friend of the family. The bail is going to be set at $500,000, cash only. You're staying right here until the bulldozers take down that eyesore you call a business. He stood up, looking at Sarah. Let's go. We have a press conference to prep for. Sarah stood, gathering her papers with a practiced efficiency. She didn't look at me as she turned to leave. Sarah, I shouted, the ledger, the physical one my grandfather kept. Where is it? She stopped at the door, her back to me. I burned it, Elias. It was just an old book filled with dust and bad memories. It's over. Sign the papers tomorrow, or don't. Either way, the heritage is gone. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing in the small room like a gunshot. I sat there in the silence, the weight of the twin betrayals pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. They hadn't just stolen my future, they were systematically erasing my past. But as I sat there, the shock began to mutate. The nausea was still there, but beneath it, a cold, hard core of fury was beginning to solidify. They had made one crucial mistake. They thought I was just a cook. They thought because I was quiet and hard-working I was soft. They forgot that my grandfather didn't just build a diner. He survived a war and a depression to do it. And he had taught me that when someone tries to take your land, you don't just fight, you scorched the earth so they have nothing left to stand on. I looked up at the security camera in the corner. I knew the young jailer Bobby was watching. "Bobby," I said, my voice low and steady. "I know you're there, and I know your father was my grandfather's best friend. I need you to do something for me. And if you do, I'll make sure you're the one wearing that sergeant's badge when the smoke clears from this mess." I waited. For a long minute, there was only the hum of the lights. Then, the intercom crackled. "What do you need, Mr. Thorne?" Bobby's voice was small, but it was there. "I need you to get a message to a man named Arthur Vance," I said. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Mark's father, the retired sheriff. He hasn't spoken to Mark in 5 years." "I know," I said, a grim smile finally touching my lips. "That's exactly why he's the only man who can help me burn this whole thing down." The transformation didn't happen with a roar. It happened with a click, the sound of a key turning in a lock I didn't even know I possessed. As I sat in that cell, the image of Sarah burning my grandfather's ledger burned into my mind. Something inside me shifted. The grief that had been suffocating me for hours suddenly condensed, cooling into a hard, sharp shard of ice. They had taken my freedom, my wife, and my business, but they had made a fatal error. They had underestimated the quiet man. They thought my silence was weakness, never realizing it was where I did my best thinking. When Bobby, the young jailer, smuggled a burner phone to me under a tray of lukewarm cafeteria food, my hands weren't shaking anymore. I didn't call a high-priced lawyer. I called the one man Mark Vance feared more than the law itself, his father, Arthur Vance. Arthur had been the sheriff for 30 years, a man of iron integrity who had retired in shame when he realized his son was a narcissist who used the badge as a bludgeon. They hadn't spoken in years, but I knew Arthur loved the town, and he loved the truth. "Arthur," I said when the old man picked up, his voice like gravel, "they're tearing down the heritage, and they're using your name to do it." 6 hours later, the ice in my veins had turned to a focused, lethal energy. Arthur had been busy. He didn't just have connections, he had the old guard, retired deputies and clerks who still held the keys to the kingdom. While Mark was busy preening for the local news, Arthur was in a basement office with a state prosecutor, looking at the digital trail Sarah thought she'd erased. She was a brilliant bookkeeper, but she was arrogant. She had deleted the local files, but she didn't know I'd installed a cloud-based security system 6 months ago after a minor break-in. I'd never told her the password, not out of mistrust, but because she'd always laughed at my paranoia about technology. Every second of them planting those drugs, every forged signature being practiced at my kitchen table was stored on a server in Virginia. The retribution came at high noon the following day. Mark had organized a press conference right in front of the diner.
He wanted the spectacle. He wanted to be the hero who shattered the drug den.
He stood there, chest puffed out, Sarah at his side looking every bit the grieving but resilient new owner. A dozen cameras were pointed at them. "Today, we reclaim our town's history from those who would poison it," Mark announced, his voice booming for the microphones. I stepped out of a black SUV parked just behind the press line. I wasn't in an orange jumpsuit. I was in my best charcoal suit, the one I'd worn to our wedding. Beside me was Arthur Vance and 4 officers from the State Bureau of Investigation. The silence that fell over the crowd was absolute. I watched the blood drain from Sarah's face, her skin turning a sickly, translucent gray. Mark's hand went instinctively to his holster, but Arthur stepped forward, his eyes boring into his son's with a look of such profound disappointment it was more devastating than a physical blow. "Stand down, Mark," Arthur said. his voice quiet but carrying over the entire parking lot. The SBI has the footage. From the office ceiling. We watched you put the bag in the freezer, son. We watched Sarah sign the deed with a dead man's hand. This is a setup, Mark roared, his face turning a deep, ugly purple. Elias is a criminal. I have the evidence. You have a fantasy, Mark, I said, stepping forward. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. I walked right up to the podium, looking Sarah directly in the eyes. She was trembling so hard she had to grab the microphone stand to stay upright. You said you wanted to be a person of consequence, Sarah. Well, you finally achieved it. You're going to be the lead story in every paper in the state. Just not the way you pictured. I turned to the lead SBI agent. The documents are in the black briefcase in the trunk of the cruiser Mark is driving. The real ones. The ones they were going to discover as part of my confession. The arrest was swift and public. The cameras caught every second of Mark Vance being forced into the back of a state cruiser, the very fate he'd designed for me. Sarah didn't fight. She just collapsed onto the pavement, her expensive suit staining in the gutter, weeping not for me, but for the life she had just forfeited. As they led her away, I leaned down, my voice a cold whisper in her ear. You burned the ledger, Sarah, but you forgot that the story isn't in the paper. It's in the man who wrote it. The legal fallout was a scorched earth campaign. Mark was hit with dozens of charges, from racketeering to civil rights violations. He's currently serving 15 years in a federal facility 3 states away. Sarah took a plea deal, turning on her brother to save herself, but she still received 7 years for forgery and conspiracy. The Vance legacy in that town was dismantled in a matter of months. 6 months later, the morning air is crisp, smelling of damp pavement and the first hint of autumn. I stand in the kitchen of the Heritage, the familiar heat of the grill a comforting weight against my skin. The "Under New Management" sign is gone, replaced by a new one that looks exactly like the one my grandfather hung in '54. The diner is packed. The bell above the door chimes, a cheerful, welcoming sound. Bobby, now a deputy under a new, honest sheriff, sits in the corner booth, enjoying a stack of blueberry pancakes. I look around at the green vinyl booths, the amber lamps and the polished wood, and I realize that a legacy isn't something you can steal or forge. It's not in the deed or the dirt. It's in the breath you take when you realize you're finally home, and the walls are held up by something stronger than bricks. They tried to bury me, but they forgot I was a seed. And now, in the quiet warmth of my own creation, I finally know what it means to be free. The past is a shadow, but the light is mine to keep.